next up, we have our Professor Christopher Harmon. Chris and I met 26 years ago at Marine Corps University at the Command Staff College. Very dedicated professional and good friend and colleague. Chris wrote his political science dissertation on terrorism in the early 1980s and continued that work as legislative aide for foreign policy to a member of Congress, and later as director of counterterrorism studies in Asia and Europe for the U.S. government. Professor at civilian and military graduate schools, including the Naval War College. Dr. Harmon began teaching courses on terrorism and counterterrorism at IWP after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. He now serves as a full-time professor at IWP. He's lead author or editor of 8 books, formerly held the Bren Chair of Great Power Competition at Marine Corps University in Quantico, and now serves as Distinguished Fellow at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare. Chris will speak with us today about the Reagan Doctrine and freedom fighters. So, come on, Chris.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you. I also am addressing a war subject this morning, but if you'll forgive me, I'll start in a somewhat light tone. I was unfolding my Washington Post not long ago. It's a traditional thing we all do here when we're stuck with living in the city. And there was a beautiful, fine, noble picture of Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, which was there in color. He was wearing a brown suit, which fashion people during his time used to say nobody could get away with that in a formal city except Ronald Reagan. And the photo showed him striding down this very elegant corridor of the White House. And he clutched a speech in his hands and looked very purposeful and serious, and you wondered if something historic was going to happen. The picture was just lovely. I've still got it. And then the Post did what they so often do. They sort of smeared the luster out of anything in public life or this particular leader. So under this photo, they had big capital letters that said, "In reality." And then when you turn to the main story, the rest of the headline said, "Tearing down the myth of Ronald Reagan." And in his day, we were told people were frequently bamboozled by Reagan, that speech that we see in the picture could be a little dubious because, and this is a quote, "Reagan's speeches were little more than a farrago of erroneous statistics and spurious quotations." The Post reminded everyone that this is the guy who actually came up with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," and you sort of knew as a reader what you were supposed to think about that. And then there's always the question of whether he helped win the Cold War. That was understood to be the case at one point. But the Post hastened to tell me that that was really not so true at all. That in fact, the Soviet Union breakup was, quote, entirely, the words entirely, Soviet Union breakup was entirely due to Gorbachev's refusal to hold it together. Well, when we read a newspaper story like that, we can ask, does it really matter? Do we care about all that black ink? The occasion made me care. The occasion is a new study out, a very big biography by Max Boot called Reagan, His Life and Legend. And you note the last word, the legend. And the reviewer in presenting this was somewhat peevish about the president, but he said the book was magisterial, not the White House, not 8 years with the man in the White House, but the book that's magisterial. And so, again, does it deserve close examination? But I think it does, and here's why it does for me. For some years now, at our beloved institute and down the road at Marine Corps University, where I gave a lot of years and where Dean Robbins did as well, I've been teaching on Reagan's foreign policy and especially what we call the Reagan Doctrine. More to follow on that. And it was a worldview, and it was a set of actions, and it really does explain our victory in the Cold War in larger terms. And it was Reagan's direction and action and agency, and not simply Gorbachev's losing, that produced that result. And so the other thing for a crowd like this to remember, of course, is that some of you know people who were involved in all that action and agency, people like John Lenchowski. So there are a lot of reasons, which I'll develop more, for why I think we do care about what could be a spurious critique of a considerable presidency. The Reagan vision was one all about a free world, a more free world, better for us, better for the other democracies. The notion of a Reagan doctrine, so-called, was not introduced by a Secretary of State. In fact, sometimes George Shultz was seen in opposition to it. It wasn't an official historian. It wasn't even the president himself. It came later in a comment by Charles Krauthammer, a sort of gifted columnist of the time. Also obscure in the new book, is never mentioned, is a fellow named Dr. Jack Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler had the conception, I think, before most others. He was from a tiny think tank out in California. And it was Wheeler and his influence on people like Reagan speechwriters and, of course, William Casey. And this group began engendering the idea with the new president and working on it and developing it. Casey, of course, had been in the OSS. He takes over Central Intelligence Agency. Later, of course, he'll donate his personal library to our Institute of World Politics, which was a wonderful thing. So this team, led by Reagan, conceived that human freedom was at the essence of everything in the foreign policy. Good governments should be built at home on freedom. Men and women would fight by nature for their own freedom. Soviet despotism in Reagan's day was the biggest enemy of freedom. And so communism could be tyranny for millions, but there could be gains perhaps made against it. Remember, because Boot doesn't tell us in the book, Soviet leaders in the late 70s and early 80s were actually boasting that they had changed the correlation of forces, world correlation of forces. They were making progress on the ground, and that was important. The White House wanted to reverse that, and the White House believed that it was possible, and not everyone did. Not all the conservatives, not all the military officers you and I knew, not the independent observers. It was difficult to see how much progress could really be made. Well, this conception was dynamic and exciting. I still remember vividly the 1 hour or more I spent with Dr. Jack Wheeler about in early 1986. It was an audacious idea they had, and it was that given the fights around the world with communist regimes against insurgents, if you could win even one of those many fights, just one, you would shatter Soviet prestige about foreign affairs, and you would totally discredit what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine, and that was that communist gains are permanent. History dictates the rise and superiority of communism, and history therefore dictates that once ground is gained by communist forces, inevitably and importantly, that would always be preserved. The Reagan Doctrine was an idea about flipping that whole picture. If you could win one victory, you could take down their prestige, and you could embrace the insurgents and the opponents of communism and move in that way. And the main countries, of course, where this was involved were places like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Cambodia, Angola, and once or twice there was discussion of another country, Mozambique. They asked me to be somewhat personal today about some of my experiences. Well, I was lucky to be a congressional staffer during Reagan's second term. And in the House where I worked, there was a lot of interest in the Nicaraguan case especially, and then the Afghan case, and lots of others. Nicaragua was dominant at the time. Daniel Ortega remains the victor in the whole thing. Of course, the Sandinistas had come in 1979. U.S. did a great deal in the beginning of the Reagan term to try to get them moved aside and open up some space for freedom in Nicaragua. It proved impossible to beat the congressional forces against that idea. The Reagan Doctrine did not dominate. And so Nicaragua sort of carried on, hasn't it? I noticed the other day, Humberto Ortega died, and he died under house arrest. So the Sandinistas were deemed by Reagan to be tyrannical, and even the brother, who was the defense minister for the Sandinistas, ended up being called a critic and locked down under house arrest. And that's how Humberto Ortega faded out just a few days ago. Well, this vision that was contrary then, this vision of the Reagan Doctrine and exporting freedom, it does unfold gradually. There's words in the campaign about helping in Angola. There's that early interest in Nicaragua. There's a famous 1982 June speech at Westminster, which Mr. Reagan devoted a lot of attention to, which was seen as fabulous and a great endorsement for freedom, and a great repudiation of Marxism-Leninism, and in fact a rare prediction. Very few people did such things. He predicted that Marxism-Leninism would end up on the ash heap of history. At the time, people thought that was wildly unrealistic. So the Hill was working this, and among our wonderful profs who were involved in Reagan Doctrine stuff is Al Santoli, the great Vietnam writer. He was working with the Cambodians. Charlie Wilson, of course, was made famous in a fun movie about helping get weapons into the Afghan Mujahideen. I can tell you that more or less that story's true. And that U.S. aid and weapons was very, very important to the Mujahideen, and that, in fact, a provision of the Stinger missiles, which is so famous, did change the nature of the war, and the Soviets began losing that war. It's not simply that they were a little weary, as Max Boot suggests, and wanted to leave. They were losing the war, and that's why they wanted to leave. By term two, maybe 86 or so, the Reagan Doctrine really looks like it's starting to change maps. Before, the news had always been about gains on the ground by the Soviets and their allies, about Red Army air transports moving thousands of Cuban troops around the chessboard of Africa. That's mostly forgotten now. The word was gains. The word were new communist governments in places like Angola and Mozambique. Well, the maps began to change just a little bit, and there were some gains. And the new map showed some hot points that were glowing. And people like Reagan and his team and Jack Wheeler believed that there was a kind of subtle linking of this with global thinking, which kind of united these disparate fights against communism. It was quite ideological and it was quite idealistic. Well, I think this is really important for us at IWP. And I'm going to offer you about 6 reasons why. It's the kind of thing that we teach it frequently in our classes at IWP. This emerging new strategy by Reagan was really original. And if we look, for example, back to, there's 2 editions of the famous book on containment by John Lewis Gaddis. If we look at that book, we see that in the past there had been debate, just debate, in the Eisenhower administration and onward about so-called rollback. Well, we never did rollback as a U.S. foreign policy, but this Reagan Doctrine, frankly, was a kind of limited rollback. I think so. I noticed the other day in looking at James Baker's memoirs that he says that too. And I think that's right, and I think it's important. And taking the decision to actually regain ground went against certain precedents, like us not doing so in '56 in Hungary, and I think it's important morally and politically. A second reason is I think that many of the students we get at the Institute, and maybe you had the experience in your own schooling, come in with this sort of impression, often unpleasant, I guess, if you're very patriotic, that we Americans have so often stood with some dictator against revolutionary or progressive forces around the world. This Reagan Doctrine flips that picture completely, whatever you think of the truth of it. The Reagan Doctrine said free peoples can free themselves from governments which have communist alliances abroad, and get rid of the Cuban troops in Africa, get indigenous Africans running their own governments in non-communist forms. And so the Reagan Doctrine was truly revolutionary, and I don't think that's enough appreciated. Third reason is I have the pleasure of teaching a course on military strategy, and we talk a lot about whether strategies match policy. So the enunciated national objective is supposed to then be served by multiple strategies, ideally. Does strategy match policy? This really did. This set indigenous fighters and indigenous idealists against their own communist regimes. And so it was concordant with the Reagan view of a more free world, and it was concordant with ideals about freedom. And the strategy of limited material aid and moral pressure was very, very effective. There was a good policy strategy match, as they would say in an analysis of strategy. A fourth reason is that this was very efficient, highly efficient. The amounts of money that were argued over for months and months in Congress were usually very small. Afghanistan was probably an exception. The other country cases like Cambodia and Angola were exceedingly small. So it's highly efficient. It's an efficient strategy. And a fifth one is that another kind of economy. It takes note of the problems with the Soviet economy. Reagan was an early student of the failures of the Soviet economy. He did think they would doom the economy. Churchill had talked about that too, but very few people did. Reagan, didn't, although he had read, Friedrich Hayek and such, Reagan didn't need that kind of instruction because he sort of intuited that communism was an artificial economy and that therefore it might well fail. This strategy was an effort to push that failure and to increase that failure, to push it to the max. It was a kind of attrition strategy, and it had economic components, and it had a lot of political and legal and military components. And in all those fights around the world, places like Afghanistan and Angola, we were draining Soviet resources and bleeding Soviet soldiers, and we weren't doing it with American lives. There's almost no American lives at question here. The last of the things I'll mention, kind of sixth reason I think this is so worthy for people interested in strategy or graduate education in poli-sci. This is a case of winning without fighting. We hear about that sometimes. The concept is, 2,500 years old and with Sun Tzu, but we've also explored it at lecture series at the Institute of World Politics. Caitlin Schindler, Doug Strusen, Philip Hughes, David Glancy, John Linchowski, others have been involved in that lecture series. Winning without fighting is exactly what we do in a kind of macro term with this particular Reagan doctrine. We did get tremendous success in the Afghan theater. We did get limited strategic success in some of the other theaters. And as a result, we get a clear marker about where we stand, but also we directly impact the strength of the Soviet enemy. And in the end, there is no global war, which I remember one of my mentors was convinced there would be. There was no global war. The Soviet Union broke up, And some of those countries, not enough, but some actually we were involved with in the Reagan Doctrine, did then liberate themselves. So I never ask my students at the Institute to agree necessarily with my view of this, but I do encourage them to see the fundamental strategic and political and moral questions that lay at the bottom of the Reagan Doctrine. And it was, I think, a triumph of a successful strategy making by our 40th president. With that, I would turn over to you to see whatever you wish to discuss. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think Reagan had it right with respect to limited incursions and so forth. But what happens when, and frankly, I saw a little bit of that in Trump in his administration. But what happens when, you know, the fever gets a little more aggressive and we go into Vietnam or we go into Afghanistan and we lose a lot of people over this same concept?
Yeah, the real distinguisher here is the commitment of indigenous forces in their... The difference is commitment of indigenous forces versus troops. You know, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam, as well as lots of Vietnamese fighting for their own freedom. We had nobody in Angola. I had a major of Marines who was a great mentor of mine later as a senior officer, who was one of the liaisons. He was there with, you know, a SAT radio and connections to the Central Intelligence Agency and his own corps. And he was giving reports from Angola. We didn't have anybody in Angola. The president raised the low limit of military advisors in El Salvador from 28 to 52. We never exceeded that cap. 52 people in El Salvador. So while there was a lot of attention to the Vietnam phenomenon, it was impossible in those circumstances. One of the things you learn, I think, from the Reagan Doctrine, how interesting and smart it is that if it's the right war, and we're just providing inspiration and material aid, there need be no impact, you know, with caskets coming home to America. You know, in our experience in the Philippines, we put well, I don't know, we put hundreds of thousands at least over a cycle. In the decades we were in the Philippines after 1900, and it was a tough counterinsurgency war. It left a lot of bruises, and some of it was pretty ugly. Waterboarding was common. It was dreadful, and that was a long slog. But after World War II, all we had was an advisory mission. And we helped destroy the Huck Balahap guerrilla insurgency, mostly because there was a genius who was a president in SecDef named Ramon Magsaysay, one of the great men of the 20th century, gets almost no credit. Ramon Magsaysay was a brilliant president, and he defeated a very powerful Marxist insurgency. And all we had were advisors, brilliant guys like Edward Lansdale from the CIA. So you have to pick your war. And where you do best, in Reagan's view, was not to do it all yourself, but was to help the guys who were fighting for their own freedom.
Thank you for your comments and your ideas. I agree with them. So if you were advising a new president in January, on how important it is that we kind of continue this Reagan Doctrine under a new president to increase our support for Ukraine, can you just outline what that might look like?
Ukraine's, of course, a great debate point for us, and I think it raises one of the problems with the Reagan Doctrine very clearly. There are a lot of links, how much aid to give, how public it should be or private, and one of the things that bothers, I would say, our conservatives a lot is what happens if we lose. When you have a limited commitment like this, you bring to yourself a certain amount of the moral duty involved. You kind of, in an indirect way, become responsible for the outcome. And in places like Angola, I was deeply, deeply frustrated that we did so little and that eventually the UNITA insurgents lost. And one of the most corrupt communist governments remained in power. I was opposed for personal reasons to the Mozambique intervention. We didn't do it, luckily, and that government, too, is still in power. It's called Frelimo. It's a dreadful operation. But the other side of it is that if you give support to guerrillas and they lose or don't prevail, are you sort of involved with the bloodshed and somewhat culpable, but in the end can't see victory? That's very possible. And some conservatives now, and others, non-interventionists, political conservatives, others, are worried about that could happen in the Ukraine. So I personally very much support Ukraine aid, but that's not really the point. The point, to try to answer your question, was that there are some of the same questions. There are, in this present case, not legal questions like Iran-Contra became a legal disaster for Mr. Reagan. He handled it terribly, and everyone knows that. But the strategic, the moral, the political factors are quite similar, and so too is that drama about what limited war is. How limited can it be? And you know, and I'm sure as I do, many a military officer who thinks, you know, most war shouldn't be limited, either don't do it, or if you do it, you go in fully. And that was what the so-called Weinberger Doctrine taught some years ago. But reality is more complicated. And before and after Weinberger, there were 1,000 limited wars, and we're fighting one right now in the Ukraine. So the Weinberger Doctrine is not American policy. But all these things have ramifications and challenges. It keeps our seminars pretty warm sometimes. Jim? Thank you. Thank you.